And hello, I am Christian Stevenson with the Mississippi State University Extension Service in Hancock County, joining you for another online presentation. Very much appreciate you joining me today. And if you are watching on YouTube, I appreciate you joining us that way as well. If you are watching on YouTube, I do encourage you to hit the subscribe button. That'll let you know when I have new videos up so we can learn more about gardening and horticulture. I'd also encourage you, if you've watched any or all of these presentations, if you're here live over in the chat box, you're going to see a link, and that's to an evaluation for this program, which asks about the value of this program to you, as well as probably the most important part for me is that there's this little section where you can suggest future topics that you would like to learn about. And I would very much appreciate you completing that survey so that topics like this one, which is suggested by one of the people who've attended these programs, so I can put these presentations together and really target the programs to the interest of the people who are watching them. So whether you're here live or watching on YouTube, you have the opportunity in the YouTube. This will be in the video description. So you can follow that link and fill out that evaluation as well, and really give me some input on future programs. So today we are going to talk about earthworms and vermicomposting. We've had the opportunity to talk a little bit about composting previously, and during that presentation, I very briefly talked about vermicomposting. But I think it'll be interesting to go into a good bit more detail about earthworms and some of their biology, as well as how to have a productive worm farm where you can produce your own vermicompost at home, which is remarkably easy and very interesting to do. So I want to start out talking a little bit about earthworms. It's something we've all grown up with. We've all seen them, but they remain a little bit of a mystery to many of us. And there are certainly, of course, they're grouped as terrestrial invertebrates. So they live on on dry land, and they don't have a skeleton, or at least don't have an internal skeleton. And there are about 9,000 different species of earthworms that we know of throughout the world. And we can group earthworms into three very broad categories based on their behavior. And the first group are the anisic earthworms. And there's a type of earthworm that we all grew up calling night crawlers. And night crawlers fall into this group. And they have this really interesting behavior. They build permanent vertical burrows down in the ground, 4 to 6 feet in depth. And if those permanent homes are disturbed or eliminated, these night crawlers will cease growing, will cease breeding. And so having those permanent burrows is very important to them. The second group are the endogeeic earthworms. The European gray worm is a good example, and the picture there in the middle is the European gray worm. And unlike the night crawlers, they build horizontal burrows, so burrows that are along the sort of the length of the ground as opposed to being up and down. And they, of the types of earthworms, are really the only ones that feed on large quantities of soil. They feed on mineral soil particles and decaying organic matter. And they are very important in their native ecosystems for mixing and aerating the soil to help incorporate minerals into the topsoil. And the last group, which is really going to be the most important group for the conversation we're having today, are the epigeic earthworms. And the red wiggler, which is probably the most common worm used in worm farms and used as bait and used in vermicomposting, is the red wiggler or Icinia foetida. Unlike these other earthworms, they do not build permanent burrows, and we tend to find them in areas that have a lot of organic matter, that very upper topsoil layer, and particularly in forests under piles of leaves and under decaying logs. You'll even find them in things like piles of manure. And again, unlike the other earthworms, they're not burrowing down very deeply into the soil, and their behavior makes them very good at adapting to a vermicompost system. So two species, Icenia fetida and Icenia andre, constitute or make up about 80 to 90% of all of the earthworms that are raised on a large scale commercial basis. There will be one other, Icenia hortensis, that is another worm that you might see fairly frequently. So I want to talk a little bit about their biology. I think it's interesting. They're all in the phylum Annelida, and annelid literally means ringed. And if you look at an earthworm, you'll see all of those ring segments down the length of their body. And how many they have is going to be based on what species they are. So a red wiggler may have about 95, whereas a nightcrawler, which is a much larger worm, can have up to around 150. And the very front, or what we call the anterior end or the head of the earthworm, has what's called a prostomium, and that is a little covering over their mouth that protects it and allows them to force their way in through the soil. They also have little hairs along their segments. They're called setae, or we can call them bristles. And those extend and retract and help the earthworm move through the soil. In addition to this, one of the things, of course, if you ever pick up earthworms, they feel a little slimy because they produce a mucus that helps them not only move through the soil, but also helps them sort of stabilize their burrows and their castings. When they feed, of course, their digestive system. A lot of us dissect earthworms in school. Their digestive tract extends the whole length of their body, and they take in soil or plant litter that has those decomposing organic residues. They'll use some grit to help break that down and allow it to be digested. But one thing that we might not think about is earthworms actually do have taste cells. So they can taste the food that they're eating, and they do have preferences for the kind of food that they like. So when they did experiments to figure out what earthworms preferred, they figured out that they preferred carrot leaves to celery, and preferred celery to cabbage. So just like us, they do have preferences for the food that they eat. Earthworms do breathe through their skin. So they have oxygen exchange through the walls of their epidermis. And because of that, it's very important that they stay moist. They need to stay good and wet. They have that mucus layer that helps them do that. Um, a lot of they are related to some aquatic organisms, so they can live for months completely submerged in water, so long as there is sufficient oxygen in that water. And one of the reasons why we see them coming up to the surface following a rainstorm is low oxygen content water moving down, and they're coming up seeking that oxygen that they need. Earthworms are going to be very sensitive to being dried out. That can be fatal to them, but excess water not necessarily a problem for them. Oftentimes, we will see after a rainstorm there might be some worms that we find dead out on sidewalks, things like that. They are very sensitive to sunlight. There's a red pigment in their skin. It's very sensitive to ultraviolet rays. Same thing we're protecting ourselves from with a sunblock. And that can cause paralysis in some worms. Long-term exposure can be fatal. And oftentimes, again, if we see them dead outside after a rainstorm, it's because the sun came out, and that's actually what caused the problem. Talk a little bit about their reproduction. Earthworms are hermaphroditic. They are both male and female. To breed, they exchange the sperm, and those are deposited into a cocoon that is produced by an organ that's called the clitellum. If you look at the length of the worm, there's going to be that little section. The first picture down there in the bottom left, you can see it towards the right side of that picture, kind of off color section, produces a cocoon that looks a little bit like a grape seed. One end's a little bit round, one end's a little bit pointed. That will have a number of eggs dependent on the species of the worm. And they start off kind of a pearlish yellow color and then turn darker brown over time as the young mature. So Asenia fetida, again, the red wiggler, the one we're going to spend the most time talking about, will generally have 3 worms per cocoon and hatch in something between 30 and 75 days and be mature and ready to produce another generation after another 53 to 76 days. And a lot of that time difference is going to be related to temperature. Now, there was a really interesting survey that I had the opportunity to look at as I was preparing this presentation. The author was very kind to send me updated links to even more recent data, which I certainly appreciate. And there are 27 species of earthworms that are found here in Mississippi. You'll find fairly similar numbers in other areas of the Southeast United States. One thing that is really notable about earthworms is that while we do have native species of earthworms here in the Southeast United States, 15 of the ones that we see in Mississippi, or 15 of the 27 species are native species, many areas of North America do not have native earthworms at all. There are no native species of earthworms in some northern forests, areas like that. Glaciation, last ice age would have killed off any earthworm populations. So any earthworms we see in those areas are introduced. Even looking at the survey here in Mississippi, the 2 most common species were introductions, one from Europe and one from Southeast Asia. So we do have a lot of introduced earthworms. Here in Mississippi, they don't tend to cause a problem, but there are some areas where those introduced earthworm species are actually quite damaging. So there are ecosystems in North America that evolved without the presence of those earthworm species. And because of that, the earthworms that are introduced can cause really serious issues. They eliminate the leaf litter that's needed for the establishment of young trees and understory plants. And so you can see that the 2 pictures that I have on the slide, one is a native forest ecosystem where there aren't those earthworms present, and then the other does have those earthworms. And you can see a fairly striking difference between the forest floor in those 2 areas. You can also see problems with earthworms in increasing soil erosion, or even kind of conversely leading to compacted soils in those forest ecosystems. They remove what's called the duff layer of that decomposing leaf litter. So not really an issue here in Mississippi, but certainly an issue in some other areas of the country. So that was our little talk about the biology of earthworms. It's a really fascinating subject. I encourage you to go and do some more reading on that because it's just a really interesting topic. But I'm going to spend the rest of our time together today talking about vermicomposting, and that is using earthworms to consume and recycle organic matter to create a really good nutrient-rich soil amendment that is very useful in gardening and horticulture. Of course, there's all of the benefits that go along with composting in general, where we're reducing the amount of waste that's entering into our landfills. So a lot of our kitchen waste, things like that. One of the previous presentations, I mentioned about 2/3 of what we're putting in landfills could be composted rather than going into those landfills. So as much waste as we can reduce is beneficial to the environment, as well as providing us a functionally free product that can really help us grow in our gardens. So the process of vermicomposting uses worms. There's still fungi and bacteria and other organisms like insects that participate in that process, but the primary action is by the worms. And when we use vermicompost as our in our gardens, we can see some really significant benefits. We're providing some nutrients to the soil, and we're providing them in a way that's very accessible to the plants. We're also increasing the soil's structure and ability to hold nutrients in that form that's available. Um, Increasing the aeration of the soil, so increasing that soil structure again, aiding drainage or water holding capacity if we have a heavy clay soil or a sandy soil. And there actually has been some really interesting research that the beneficial microbes in the soil that are associated with vermicompost can have some impacts on suppressing plant diseases, particularly those sort of nasty root diseases that are hard to deal with, like Pythium, which causes damping off in vegetable crops and some other crops. You can see a couple of pictures here. The first one on the top there is just a direct comparison between zero vermicompost and 30% food waste vermicompost. You can see the striking difference in the growth of those plants. And then some tomato plants down on the bottom where they've used different levels of vermicompost and vermicompost tea, which is just vermicompost that's been steeped in water as a amendment for the growth of those plants. And you can really see a fairly striking difference in the growth of those plants as well. So in terms of choosing worms for your vermicompost, again, the very most common one that people use is Eisenia fetida, or the red wiggler. They are a small red worm. They're one of those epigeic worms that live in that very uppermost layer of that organic matter in the top of the soil. And we use them for vermicomposting because they just adapt very well to that environment. It's easy to replicate the environment that they want to live in. But red wigglers are also very tolerant of changes in environmental conditions. They have a short lifespan and a really fast reproductive rate, so it's easy to build populations of them. And it is relatively easy to simply to go online and order red wigglers shipped right to you. There are a number of places that will do that. And we'll talk a little bit in just a minute about how much you're going to need in order to get started for your worm farm. You can, of course, potentially also purchase red wigglers at a bait store. Usually, they're going to be a little bit more expensive at a bait store than you would see just purchasing them online from a worm farm. They'll multiply on their own, and if you have a good healthy population, you'll actually see the cocoons and immature worms and adult worms all present and going through their life cycle all at the same time. I mentioned another worm that you might see, and I see this when I go to some bait stores, is Eisenia hortensis, and that is also sold as a bait worm. You can see a comparison between the size of the two worms. Eisenia hortensis is quite a bit larger, but they also have a slower reproductive rate. So they don't grow, their population doesn't grow quite as quickly. They're not going to feed quite as quickly. So it's going to be a little bit slower. They're also a little bit more temperamental in terms of making sure you maintain the environmental conditions they need. They also have a tendency to burrow down further into the medium that you have them in. And so it makes it a little bit more difficult to separate them out when it's time to harvest your vermicompost. So generally recommend that you just order some Icenia fetida or red wigglers. I think that's going to be the best option. But if if they're available to you and you want to use them, there's nothing wrong inherently with using Icenia hortensis. So how big of a worm bin do we actually need to have in order to have an effective vermicompost system? And really, that's going to depend on how much vegetable waste, how much kitchen waste you're producing, and that you want to process through vermicomposting. Generally speaking, about a pound of worms is going to be about 1,000 worms, and they will eat about a half pound of food scraps a day. So if you have a family of four, you produce about a pound of kitchen scraps a day or 5 to 7 pounds per week. So if you have 2 pounds of worms in a bin with at least 5 square feet of surface, that's going to really easily accommodate that. If you're a household that uses a lot more vegetables, if you're a vegetarian, then you may see that you have a little bit more food scraps. But you can figure out that a pound of worms is a half pound of food scraps per day, and that gives you a really, really good way to just kind of figure out what you want to build towards. All right, where you place your worm bin can be important. Ideally, you want to put them in a cool, shaded outdoor area. You don't want your worm bin to overheat. If it's out in the direct sun, that can just overheat the entire system. The worms will stop feeding if the temperatures get too high. You also want to protect it from fire ants. Lifting it up off the ground is a good idea, just to prevent attracting fire ants because it is going to have a food source available in it. Also, if it dries out a little bit, it can be a little bit more prone to being attractive to ants. You also do want to protect it from rain. If the whole system gets waterlogged, you can have all of your worms have an unpleasant time. The oxygen levels will drop down very quickly, and that can cause serious problems and unpleasant odors. You also want to have it in an area that's convenient to your kitchen. So that's where you're going to be producing your kitchen waste. So having it somewhere where you can just kind of step out a door and add stuff to your vermicompost bin, that works perfectly fine. It is perfectly okay to keep a worm bin inside. They're not going to produce a lot of odors. The worm bins don't smell bad as long as they're being operated correctly. And it's a lot easier to maintain temperatures in some of these things if you have it indoors. So something like a garage or a storage room is perfectly okay as a place to put your worm bin. There are a lot of different approaches to ways to build a vermicompost bin. Probably the simplest one is just a simple plastic bin. It's made from an inexpensive plastic storage tub. You drill a whole bunch of drainage holes down there in the bottom. Make sure you add air holes around the edges and around the sides to allow air to percolate in. You really want to make sure you have a lot of drainage holes because any bad drainage problems can lead to problems with odor. You do want to set this on top of something. You may have some water drain through it. So you do want to set it on top of something that's not going to be that's either going to be able to collect that water or just make sure it's not going to be a problem for you. And really, outdoors, this is going to be very prone to getting very, very hot. So that's going to be a difficult area to use this kind of system. But this is very well adapted to use in an indoor situation. When I do demonstrations, or if I build a little demonstration worm bin for young people, I just use a 5-gallon bucket. I drill a whole bunch of holes in it and put some bedding material and some food in there and the worms, and even a 5-gallon container works perfectly fine as a very small vermicompost bin. It has handles, so it's easier to cart around. Probably the most popular and probably the one that I would recommend in terms of using a very simple system to have a good active vermicompost bin is a stacking tray system. Stacking tray systems work on the principle that the worms follow the food. So you start off with just the very bottom section of that. You can see the sort of breakdown of one of the commercially made systems there. You start off with just the initial thing. You add bedding to it, add food to it. As the worms feed on it and as they break down all of that material, you can stack another tray on there with a little bit more bedding and a little bit more food for them, and the worms will naturally go where the food is. They like to be up near the surface in that organic matter, so they're going to move up, and that makes it extraordinarily easy to harvest your vermicompost rather than having to sort through things. We'll talk a little bit about that. You can just take off the top, remove that bottom tray that's sort of finished vermicompost, and that makes a very, very simple system for you to use. Um, these can be made. You can make them out of plastic tubs. You can just add mesh down at the bottom or drill an awful lot of little holes in there, and that does work. The commercially available kits are just fine. Two of them are Can of Worms and Worm Factory. There are quite a few more out there. No particular preference for any of them. Um, a lot of them have a very convenient drain, so you can put a little bucket down there at the bottom. Make sure that they're draining effectively. Really effective, easy to use system for maintaining a worm farm. And normally, I looked up the prices for what those commercial systems cost, and usually you're looking at investing somewhere between 80 or 90 up to about $130, dependent on the kit that you purchase and where you purchase it from. You can, of course, also make a homemade bin. Just a wooden box that's a foot deep by about 2 foot wide and about 3 foot long is a really good, convenient size to use. Make sure you're including drainage holes that are drilled into the bottom. You want to have a good hinged lid that you can easily take off. And wood bins, unlike those plastic containers, allow for air movement in through them. They tend to stay a little bit cooler, and they don't tend to have the sort of odor or moisture problems you may see with using a plastic bin outdoors. It's a couple of things you want to avoid is you don't want to use any pressure treated wood. You don't want to you want to have wood that's not going to have any chemicals that may give the worms any issues. And very often people will paint these homemade bins. There's absolutely no problem with that. It can be beneficial because painting that outside, particularly painting it a light color, light blue or white, is going to help radiate some extra heat energy away from it and keep that temperature a little bit lower. You just don't want to paint the inside of it. Again, just avoiding having any odors or anything that may discourage the worms. All right, setting up your worm bin is really straightforward. You just want to start off, and of course, this will vary a little bit by the size of the bin you're using, but fill it with about an 8-inch layer of a material for bedding. You can use things like shredded newspaper or office paper. Composted manure is just fine, as is peat moss or core fiber. That's the coconut husk fiber that I like to use for container gardening. And you want to moisten it down before adding it to the bin. It should be just as wet as kind of a wrung out sponge. So if you pick it up and grip it, water, if you have any water out of that, it should just be a drop or so. If it squirts water out, that's way too much. but just kind of about what you would expect for a wrung out sponge. Um, as the worms are going to be eating, they're going to be breaking down all that bedding material. So you will want to add about a 2-inch layer as needed as that old bedding is consumed, and just add a small amount of garden soil as well. Just regular native soil from your garden is just fine. And that's going to add in a little bit of microorganisms, sort of good bacteria that are necessary, as well as adding in a little bit of grit. So the worms have a little part of their digestive system that contains grit that helps them grind up some of the things that they eat. Once you have all that in there, you can just add your worms into one corner of the bin. Just kind of pull the bedding back and add them in there, and you are ready to go. We do want to make sure we're maintaining our bin well. So we want to start off making sure that the temperature is as good as we can get it for the worms to grow and be active. And we're really looking for a temperature between about 60 and 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So you can see the thermometer there even has that little green area. Um, and that's really going to be the ideal temperatures. Of course, here in Mississippi, it gets a lot hotter than 80 degrees. So again, having it in a shaded area, maybe painting that white is going to be good at keeping those temperatures down a little bit. But if you can keep the temperature down all the way down to between that 60 and 70 range, it's really going to speed up the reproduction of the worms that you have in your worm bin. If the temperatures get too high, you can also add a little bit of extra water that will have a cooling effect. Using fans is really limited to to when you have a commercial worm farm, something like that. But you can also lower the amount of feedstock that's going in because the decomposition of feedstock and all that metabolic activity do have an impact of raising temperature as well. We do also want to maintain the correct moisture in our worm bin. Worms need moisture there. Again, they need that moisture to help them breathe. And so what we want is a moisture range of about 60 to 85%. Again, feels like a wrung out sponge. It's moist, but it's not wet. There are all sorts of moisture sensors that you can purchase at your local hardware, garden, or big box store. Again, keep your worm farm out of the direct sunlight. And if you want to, again, if you've just started out and you want to increase cocoon production, so we're building that worm population, stop watering the beds for a couple of days. Let that first couple of inches just really start to dry out, and then get it back up to its regular moisture level. And you should see an increase in worm reproduction so that you really get that population going. Aeration, a lot of this is going to sound very similar to things that we would do in a regular compost bin. Earthworms can survive pretty well, even when the oxygen levels are pretty low. But if the oxygen is depleted, if the bed's too wet, that can cause problems. So if we have too much moisture, we may need to increase the amount of air holes that we have in the bin. So drilling some extra holes in the side may be necessary. You can cut back on the feed because that feed does contain a lot of moisture, vegetable waste. The kitchen waste has a high water content. And just using a garden fork or something like that to just turn your compost or vermicompost a little bit will also help sort of mix the air and the water together and help help make sure there's oxygen really well integrated down into the vermicompost bin. We also want to control for pH. Earthworms are going to prefer a fairly neutral pH range, right around 6.8 to 7.2. So that's right around that neutral point. If you can test your pH with a litmus test or with a kit that you can get at big box store. We don't need to be super accurate on this. But if you do find yourself where the pH is low, if it's down, around 6.5 or lower than that, you can add a very small amount of lime in order, same agricultural lime that you would use in your garden, and that can help correct that overly acidic uh, condition. You're looking at a very small amount, only a couple of ounces. If you have a 6 foot square bedding surface, water that lime in to kind of activate it and get it reacting. It is not very common to see a condition where your pH is high. So if you have an overly alkaline situation, so the pH is up around 7.5 or higher than that. If you do see a situation like that, you can correct it just by adding a little bit of peat moss. Peat moss is very acidic, so adding some peat moss in there will help add in a little bit of acid and get that pH range back where you need it to be. All right, now we want to provide food for our worms. Earthworms will eat just about any organic matter that you put in there. But there are some kinds of things that we can add into our vermicompost that will attract other things like mice or flies. I would recommend against adding any meat products into your vermicompost bin. We don't want to add any oils like butter or mayonnaise, things like that. Dairy products, again, a lot of fat. Large amounts of citrus or things like that can actually attract fruit flies. And we don't want to add pet waste into it either. You're either going to wind up attracting mice, which we don't want to do, or we can attract flies. Interestingly, black flies are also used very effectively as a form of composting, but that's not what we're aiming at for this presentation. So we want to avoid adding those things. Some good things that we do want to add: fruit and vegetable scraps, peels, all of those sorts of things. Eggshells are great. Plain cereals, so not Lucky Charms or anything really sugary, but a plain cereal like oats is just fine. Bread or pasta. I don't mean to pick on Lucky Charms. Uh, Coffee grounds are another good addition. And even dryer lint. If you just have dryer lint from natural fibers, you don't want polyester. But dryer lint from cotton or things like that would be just fine also. And are things that the worms will be able to consume and grow and convert into very effective vermicompost for us. We do want to add food scraps to the bin gradually. Again, we're looking about a half pound of food scraps per pound of worms. You can do this two different ways. The first way that you can do it is called pocket feeding, where you're just burying food under the bedding. Burying it under the bedding is helpful because you don't have any problems attracting fruit flies and things like that. Keeps down any potential odor problems. And if you rotate or move around the spaces where you're adding in those food scraps, you get the worms to distribute evenly throughout the bin. The disadvantage of pocket feeding is that your worms are kind of evenly distributed throughout the bin. So the other way of feeding is just to spread the food scraps in a thin layer on the top of the bedding. And that's going to mean those worms are going to move up to the top. And if you don't have a tray system, that is going to make the process of harvesting your vermicompost significantly easier. Speaking of which, how to harvest your vermicompost. The entire process, in terms of when you can harvest after your initial setup is going to be about 3 to 6 months. Once you have the system set up, it's really down to how fast they're consuming their bedding material and the food scraps that you provide for them. So as soon as they've consumed everything, you're ready to go. So there are different methods of approaching harvesting your vermicompost. I guess the simplest way is the dump and sort method. You just take the contents of the bin and you put it in a pile on a tarp out in the sun. And all of those worms are going to move away from the light into the center of the pile. And then you can collect the top of the piles because the worms are going to be down in the bottom, and you can return the worms back into the bin. It's a little messy. It's kind of time consuming. I would still suggest passing the vermicompost through a screen just to make sure I'm collecting the worms back. But if you don't have a complex system, or if you just have a small vermicompost bed, there's absolutely nothing wrong with doing that. The other way of doing it is just, again, we've got the worms coming up. We will use some surface feeding to get the worms to come up to the top of the bin. And we'll just take out the top third of the bin, put it in a container, remove all of the remaining vermicompost from the bottom 2/3 of the bin, and then return the bedding and worms back into the container. And that, again, will work just fine. You just need something to put the worms in while you're collecting the vermicompost. Of course, with a stacking tray system, what you do is just remove the bottom tray, and there's your vermicompost. You put it in a container to hold on to. Again, vermicompost, you can either use it immediately, you can store it long term. It works very well as an addition to container media with a ratio of about 1/4 of the total volume of the medium for the container, up to about 1/3. You can add it to garden soil as you are planting. You can also lightly top dress plants out in your landscape by spreading 1 to 2 inches around the base of the flowers and vegetables. You don't want to have it come directly in contact with the stem or the trunk. Just like putting fertilizer out, you want to leave a little bit of space. Probably one of the easier ways is you can just let it steep in water overnight. That will solubilize or move those nutrients out into solution in water. And you can make compost tea for watering your plants, which is a very easy and effective way of using your vermicompost. Now there are some problems we run into as we try to work with our worms. Sometimes we wind up with worms dying. That can be a response to having just too much food, and reduce the amount of food that you're adding, or increase the worm population and add bedding. If the bed is too wet, you can add some dry bedding in to dry everything out. If it's too dry, you can add some water. If you've got kind of a bad smell, just like with compost, if you have that bad smell, it's a sign that some bad bacteria, it's a low oxygen environment, either because the bin is too wet or you're not getting enough oxygen in there. So correcting those moisture problems can generally resolve that. Make sure you have enough air holes for good aeration of the system. And of course, watch out, make sure you're not adding too much food, because the food just may be rotting before the worms can get to it. Excuse me. So there are some other organisms that can be a problem as well. Ants prefer really drier soil. So if you add a little bit of water, maintain a good water system for your vermicompost bed. That will tend to address that. If you have it raised up, you can, of course, you can kind of take some steps that way to just prevent the ants from being able to get into the container in the first place. If you have flies, consider adding in a little bit more bedding and covering the food in the bed, just to keep the flies away from it. Probably the most frequent issue that we see is mites, and there are different kinds of mites. Mites are another kind of invertebrate, very similar to insects, and every worm bin is going to have mites in it. Some of them are not really a problem. You have things like white and brown mites. They just feed on decaying or injured worms, but they also feed on the food that the worms want. So that can reduce how productive the vermicompost bin is. What we don't want to see is red mites. Those are parasitic to earthworms and to cocoons. They essentially feed on the blood of the earthworms. And you start to see them as kind of white or gray clusters that look like mold. Getting rid of mites in your vermicompost bed isn't really terribly difficult to do. If you leave them in the sun for very long, the mites will come up to the top and they'll die off. The worms tend to go down to the bottom. Reduce the amount of water, reduce the amount of feed you're putting in. That can eliminate some mite problems as well. You can also put moistened newspaper or burlap on top of the bed, and the mites will accumulate onto those um, pieces of paper or burlap, or very similarly, watermelon or pieces of cantaloupe. The mites will accumulate onto that, and you can pick them up and throw them away. Drop them in water to get rid of the mites. And you can kind of monitor that population. If you throw it in, you can repeat doing that until you stop seeing the mites on the fruit or on the paper, and that will let you know that you have the population under control. I'm just going to mention one other thing because I've seen this on social media a number of times fairly recently. This is the hammerhead worm. Hammerhead worms are a different kind of worm. They're not an annelid. They're not a ringed worm. They're a flatworm, a terrestrial flatworm in the phylum Platyhelminthes. And they are predators. So they do feed on earthworms, they feed on slugs and insect larvae and springtails and other little organisms running around in the landscape. And I've seen a number of calls, because this also is not a native organism to here in North America. People very concerned that these hammerhead worms are going to destroy the populations of earthworms that we have here. I don't think that it's not a significant concern at all. While we do have these here, they're not going to be present in sufficient numbers to cause any real reduction in the populations of earthworms that we have here. In other areas, the earthworms aren't native anyway, and so that's not really an issue. If you do see these, my best recommendation is just leave them alone. They're kind of interesting looking. Take a look at them, go, hey, that's neat, and move on with your day. If you do want to get rid of them, that's perfectly okay. A little bit of salt and vinegar will take care of that problem. Just like some other organisms, if you put salt on them, that tends to cause the problem. Just if you do handle them in any way, make sure you wash their hands. They have some nasty stuff in their mucus that you don't want to get on you. There's no evidence that it affects humans, but I would recommend that you wash your hands regardless. So I appreciate your time and attention today. I'm just going to mention very quickly the picture that I have here, which I blatantly stolen from Atlas Obscura. But there is, we're very familiar with the kind of small earthworms that we have here in North America, which may be 6 or 8 or 9 inches long. But there are earthworms that are native to Africa and South America and to Australia that are quite large. So they may be 3 foot or more in size. So some really interesting animals that are out there. So I appreciate it. If you're watching on YouTube, again, I appreciate your time and your attention. If you have any questions, I would be thrilled if you put those down in the comments section. I'll be very happy to come back and answer any questions that I'm able to. I'd also encourage you, you're very welcome to give me a call or to send me an email, and I'll be very happy to answer any questions you have. And again, if you'd be so kind, I would be very grateful if you'd fill out the survey that's down in the program or the video description, particularly if you have input about other topics related to gardening and horticulture and natural resources that you would like to learn about. So thank you very much, and I hope you have a wonderful day.